Hi, this is the lecture on ethics and governance of artificial intelligence. So in the grand scheme of our trustworthy AI roadmap, we have reached at the stage of the course where we'll be talking about the last two topics, ethics and regulation or governance of AI. So in the past lectures, we covered a whole range of topics around the trustworthiness of AI. That includes security, privacy, safety, transparency, and fairness, so which was our last lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to dive a little deeper into the ethical pitfalls and the ethical questions that we have around the development, deployment, and use of AI. And once we talk about ethics, we will also be touching up on regulations as to how to regulate AI in the midst of all this pitfalls, be it security, privacy, safety, or transparency, and bias. Okay, so the lecture goals, we're gonna first talk about ethics. So under ethics, we're gonna be talking about a whole bunch of topics. The ethics of AI is much like other topics. This is even more work in progress. Therefore, what we're going to cover here is somehow grounded in philosophy, the ethical philosophy, but most of the things are still to be spelled out by AI ethicists or people who work at the intersection of AI and ethics. But regardless, there is enough material to kind of spark a discussion around ethics and AI. So first we'll look at ethics, what it is and why it doesn't matter. And then we'll specifically consider examples of ethics and AI where there are ethical questions around application of AI in different domains. For example, would AI is going to replace people in the workforce? We'll talk about this notion of the boundary between humans and bots or machines in general, but specifically AI. Bias and ethics. So we've talked about fairness in the previous lecture, but we can also tie bias with ethical pitfalls. And we'll also be talking about this notion of weaponization of AI, because in the traditional sense of warfare or wars between different countries and geopolitical actors, we've been using hardware for the most part, but now we are also fighting in the cyberspace, and the introduction of AI into the cyberspace, and the fact that AI is part and parcel of hardware, military hardware that we manufacture today. And also broadly speaking, AI could be weaponized for many other things. So we'll see, we'll kind of assess the landscape of what is possibly the scenario of weaponizing AI. And then, of course, we live in on a planet that is already suffering from a lot of carbon footprint and global warming, and there is a United Nations level effort to kind of curb the carbon emission by the so-called civilization that we brought for the last, whatever years. And now AI is not really helping in that goal. So we'll look at, what are the implications of AI for the environment or generally for the planet. We'll talk about AI in copyright. There's a great deal of copyrighted material that is available online in the form of text and other media. How does this copyrighted material fare against large language models trying to ingest this to train themselves? And if we talk about ethics, rationality is a very important topic that comes in because in general, humans are perceived or assumed to act rationally when they make decisions, when they conduct themselves, or when we conduct ourselves. For example, I am discussing a lecture now, and there is some expectation of rationality from my side. if you want to take me seriously as to what I'm talking about in this lecture. Therefore, what is rational, this explicit rationality for AI systems or models. Large language models are sort of the fashion of the day, and arguably the most advanced versions of machine learning models we have today. So we'll talk about a little bit more about large language models and their ethical risks or pitfalls with large language models. And lastly, we'll talk about accountability for AI decisions. So people are expected to be accountable because there are some ethical norms that we have established and legal norms that we have established. And if we go out of bounds of the legal boundaries or the social norms, we are bound to be accountable as humans, as members of a society. Therefore, then when you cast the same question of accountability to AI agents that sometimes act on behalf of people or like people, then what is the situation of accountability? It's a very fuzzy thing. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well, although the question is not fully answered at the moment. So all these topics, we're going to go and expand a little bit more on each of them. And on the regulation side, among all the topics that we cover in this course, the regulation side is the least developed at the moment, because everybody is trying to come up with some governance or regulation frameworks, be it like countries, nations, or regional political blocs like the European Union, or global entities like the United Nations. So I'll briefly talk about what is going on in the United States, because I live here and I follow what is happening here more closely than what is going on around the world. So I'll give you the perspective of the US-centric efforts on regulation and governance. And I will also give you an example, a concrete example of what we contributed from our lab, specifically my master's student who did her thesis on extending an AI regulation framework. And broadly, we'll talk about what is going on in the level of the European Union and also globally through some efforts by the United Nations. So that's going to be our sort of agenda for the lecture on ethics and regulation. So we're going to have broadly two parts, the ethics part and the regulation part. Okay, so jumping into the ethics part, AI ethics. What is this and why does it matter? So let's start with ethics. What is ethics? So when you want to define ethics, you have to also kind of step back and talk about the framework under which you're talking about ethics, right? So it's traced back to philosophy, right? In philosophy, it's not a classification, but you can look at philosophy from three different perspectives. So there's this ontological or cosmological view of philosophy, which is basically concerned with questions like what does it mean to exist? What is the meaning of being or existence? Where do we come from as human race or Homo sapiens? What is our destiny? What is the end? What is reality, right? What is the universe? Whatever we consider to be, where we live. Who created this universe? Who is the creator? Who is God? What is God? And so all this fall under this ontological or cosmological framing of philosophy. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up philosophy here is it's really hard to kind of jump into AI ethics without having sort of the precursor which is, how AI ethics comes about. Okay. So the next thing is what we call epistemology. So again, philosophy could be looked at broadly in three ways. So this epistemological view, which is essentially about how do we perceive reality, how do we perceive knowledge, how do we procure knowledge, how do we process knowledge. Okay. Then we have what we call axiology or ethics. So that's where the ethics part of philosophy comes in. And this has to do, for the most part, with morality, aesthetics, like appreciation of a piece of art or a piece of painting by an artist, the differentiation of right from wrong, or this classification of right and wrong, and value systems, right? So these are very important things. So every time we talk about ethics, we're talking about what is morally acceptable, what's morally correct. We might appreciate aesthetics. We might differentiate between right and wrong. And we might have, based on that, we might come up with a package called the value system or value judgment, right? So, but the central piece in axiology or ethics is this notion of answering right or wrong. And when we go about answering whether something is right or wrong, we do have this notion of reasoning in two different or complementary ways. So one is the so-called deductive reasoning, where you start with a theory, you build or you frame your hypothesis, and you go through observations. For example, you collect data, you analyze data, and then you try to look at insights that would confirm your hypothesis or reject your hypothesis. So you have the option to basically support your hypothesis or otherwise. So that's one way of looking at answering right or wrong. So the deductive approach. Complementary to this is the opposite, which is the inductive approach, where you begin with observations. And from observations, let's say you collect a data set about some subject that you're studying or some phenomena you're studying, and you try to infer or extract patterns from this observations. And based on these patterns, you would build what you call tentative hypothesis. And this tentative hypothesis, if you can prove it or generalize it, it would become a theory. Okay. So these are the two ways that we do answering right or wrong, or through deductive or inductive reasoning. Okay. So that's sort of a precursor as to, the three focuses of philosophy and the two ways of reasoning, deductive and inductive. Okay. Again, before I define or I specifically talk about AI ethics, I think it's worthwhile to kind of step back and also talk about ethical philosophy because, we're talking about ethics. So ethical philosophy, you can look at it from different perspectives. And the perspective I'm going to take in this lecture is exclusively Western ethical philosophy. Because when you look at ethical philosophy or generally philosophy, you have Western philosophy, you have Eastern philosophy, you have African philosophy, and so on, right? So some of this classifications of philosophy, for example, if you look at Western and Eastern, just like the directions West and East are opposite, on some fundamental notions, these two ideologies or philosophical point of views, they do clash or they do contradict. So since this is not a philosophy class or course, I would, I would defer the Eastern part, but I'll just focus on the Western part because I'm teaching the course in the Western hemisphere. Okay. So if you have read anything about philosophy or if you've taken a course in philosophy, chances are you started with Socrates, right? The Greek philosopher, 470 BC, right? So Socrates is often termed as the father of ethical philosophy, and he emphasizes the pursuit of virtue, so through what we call critical self-examination. Okay? And he also emphasizes dialogue and the cultivation of knowledge and wisdom. Okay. So you can see virtue, which is sort of, what you value, what is your virtue, right? And there is also this question of dialogue and cultivation of knowledge and wisdom, right? Okay. Now, Plato, who was a student of Socrates, right, expands on this ethical philosophy frameworks of Socrates, and he expands on the pursuit of knowledge, the understanding of the forms, right, cultivation of virtue, and the promotion of justice, both in the individual soul and society. So Plato has a famous book called The Republic, in which he kind of outlines what the ideal society is going to be and the role of government, etc. And most, political frameworks and constitutions have some root from that book called The Republic. Okay. And Aristotle comes next after Plato, and Aristotle is Plato's student. So what Aristotle does is he came up with, or he kind of proposes this comprehensive framework for understanding the nature of human happiness. So this is the first time the pursuit of happiness was kind of mentioned and framed in a philosophical context by Aristotle, and the cultivation of virtue. So as you can see, there is some connection with what Socrates said at the beginning about virtue and the role of practical wisdom in moral decision making. So this is where, the ethical component comes in, moral decision making. Okay. So these three people obviously stand out in the timeline of ethical philosophy or philosophy in general in the Western Hemisphere. Okay. Then after Aristotle, one famous figure is Thomas Aquinas. This is an Italian philosopher. The three in the previous slide are Greek philosophers for sure. So what Thomas Aquinas does is he provides what we call a synthesis of the natural law, of virtue ethics, and Christian theology. So the first time Christian theology was incorporated into ethical philosophy was by Thomas Aquinas. And the way he did this is he offered what we call a comprehensive framework for understanding moral conduct and the ultimate purpose of human life, which are very powerful things. Right after, not right after, but after Thomas Aquinas came another Thomas, Thomas Hobbes, and this is an English philosopher. So this is, Thomas Hobbes is the first to kind of articulate about what we call self-interest or individualism, the importance of social order and security, because if somebody has self-interest, they want securities, they want social order, they want to enjoy what they have or what they believe is theirs, and the role of sovereign authority in regulating human behavior. Okay. And another English philosopher, John Locke, articulated this idea of defense of natural rights, so human rights, what we call human rights today, both at the level of constitutions of nations or the United Nations, has a lot of roots or origin from the articulations by John Locke. Religious toleration, where in many constitutions we have these articles which are enshrined in constitutions which talk about respecting other people's beliefs or religious views, including not having a religion. For example, in the United States Constitution, that we have that. The fact that government shouldn't have unlimited power. This is a very important topic, even in modern day democracy and politics. And the need for individual autonomy. So the fact that people are sovereign as individuals. So these are very important principles that govern modern day democracy and social order. This were kind of articulated for the first time from a philosophical and ethical point of view by John Locke, the English philosopher. After that, another important figure is Baruch Spinoza, who is a Dutch philosopher. So what Spinoza did is he looked at this ethical philosophy systematically to come up with a systematic approach to understanding human nature, the passions of people, and the pursuit of happiness and virtue. So as you can see, the keywords like pursuit of happiness and virtue and so on, they you can link them back to Socrates from the very beginning. But this philosophers kind of built upon what the previous philosophers have done, much like any other theory, right? And another point that I want to highlight at this point is I am not exhaustive in terms of picking important figures in ethical philosophy in the Western Hemisphere or the Western philosophy. I am actually driven by a personal test of what these philosophers have done and also their relevance to the topics of the course. So this is by no means an exhaustive crash course on philosophy. And then comes Immanuel Kant, of course, the German philosopher, who is also a very important figure in philosophy and ethical philosophy in general. So what Kant articulated is about morality based on the concepts of duty. So if someone has to be morally acceptable, or it's moral to have a duty, a responsibility. It's morally correct to be rational. And there are some universal principles that people should be governed with. So wherever you are in this universe, there are things that would be expected from you in terms of like you're here on this planet, you have to do something. So that's the sense of duty. And when you interact with everybody else, you need to be rational. And then another one of my favorite philosophers, Arthur Schopenhauer, and he's a German philosopher from the late 18th century to early 19th century. So what Schopenhauer came up with is a slightly different and perhaps arguably a dark view of human happiness. So what Schopenhauer says is Schopenhauer claims that there is this pervasive presence of suffering and the potential for transcendence through the denial of the will to live and the cultivation of compassion and aesthetic experience. So Schopenhauer argues that suffering is inevitable, right? And the human suffering is something that you cannot avoid. Okay, so compared to everybody else that I kind of highlighted, Schopenhauer seems to paint a very bleak or dark picture of life, or rationality in general. And then we have Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher. This is the guy who kind of talked about the importance of promoting happiness and minimizing suffering. So basically, after Schopenhauer kind of argued that suffering is inevitable or pain is inevitable, then Jeremy just came and said, okay, how about minimizing? If it is inevitable, we can now completely eliminate pain and suffering, so minimizing. So it's an optimization problem in a way through rational analysis and social reform. After that, John Stuart Mill, again, an English philosopher. This is the first philosopher who kind of articulated the notion of utilitarian principles or utility with a sort of a robust defense of individual liberty and commitment to pursue higher pleasure. So if something is useful, it has utility, right? So I think this is sort of the precursor for capitalism, because in capitalism we have this individualistic view of looking at the utility of something, and if something is useful, it has some utility. Therefore, we have to pay for it, or we have to ask people to pay for it. And then there is this Austrian philosopher after John Stuart Mill, Ludwig Wittgenstein, that's a German name. So what he did is this revolutionary ideas about language, meaning, and the nature of philosophical inquiry. So how we question or ask important fundamental questions. So he focused on the role of language, the role of meaning or semantics, and so on. Okay, so that was sort of a rundown of the most important figures biased by my own personal flavor of philosophers over the time, but kind of related to what we're talking about here, which is AI ethics. Okay, so now I think we're ready to kind of define or broadly talk about AI ethics. So what is AI ethics? So ethics is established principles of right or wrong, right? So we've already established that when we talked about the three pieces, the three ways of looking at philosophy, right or wrong, that guide individuals, right, and organizations. So this is about individuals, and organizations should also have ethical principles in their decision-making process. So there is a decision to be made, and that decision is right or wrong depending on your ethical values. Okay, now what we call AI ethics is it originates from the ethics that we knew before AI was important, right? So there are moral principles, considerations, responsibilities associated with the development. So when we develop AI, deployment, and the use of AI technologies. Okay, so there are moral principles, there are moral considerations or ethical considerations, and ethical responsibilities or accountabilities associated with the whole life cycle of AI technology. Okay. And now you could wonder, why do we need AI ethics? This is sort of a rhetorical question. It's like saying, why do we need ethics? If we knew why we need ethics, it shouldn't be that difficult to answer this question. But anyway, first and foremost, AI has the potential, a very huge potential, to significantly impact individuals, societies, and the whole environment that we live in. So there is no question that AI is a game changer. There's no question that AI is a disruptive technology, and disruptive in many ways that we may not even understand at the moment. So that is a very important reason, maybe probably the single most important reason that we should care about AI ethics. Another thing is, when we talk about AI, these ethical considerations that we use for other things or other aspects of life are essential for ensuring that AI models are developed and used in a responsible manner. Just like we have ethical principles embedded into product development for other critical products, like, for example, airplanes or cars or, weapons and so on, we need these ethical considerations to be there for AI models as well. The other thing, the other reason why we need AI ethics is, if we fail to address ethical issues in AI, this can lead to unintended consequences, and this could lead to harms to individuals, and broadly speaking, this will lead to this erosion or losing trust in the technology itself. Okay, so these are sort of the fundamental reasons why we need AI ethics. So now we know what AI ethics is and why we need it. Why is it important? Here are some of the ethical principles of AI. And this, as I said, the ethical aspect of AI is work in progress, and there's a lot of debates and so on around this, because it will be traced back to ethical philosophy, and there are a lot of theories around ethical philosophy. people, depending on their background, their discipline, a whole bunch of theories are still emerging. So keeping that in mind, here's a summary of what we call ethical principles of AI. One is, of course, transparency and explainability. We've talked about, explainable machine learning or AI models, but this also kind of ties back to the ethical principles of AI, because what we want is a functioning decision-making underlying algorithms, and all these understandable explanations for their decisions. All these are important to kind of reinforce some ethical principles. Accountability and responsibility. We're talking about accountability as a very important component of morality and ethics, taking responsibility, right? So holding individuals, organizations, and AI systems accountable for their actions, and designers' knowledge, and having this for the designers to have knowledge about this and follow these ethical obligations. And the other component or piece is fairness and bias mitigation. Although data and data processing pipelines are to blame for the large part for bias, as you will see, as we will discuss, bias could be tied to ethical pitfalls as well. For example, equitable treatment of individuals. This comes down to morality, right? Groups and bias-aware modeling, auditing, etc. And then, of course, we have other important moral tools or instruments like privacy and data protection that are not merely, guardrails. These are somehow traced back to human rights, right? So when we talk about privacy protection regulations, etc., the foundation is human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations from the 1940s. So compliance with data protection regulations, implementing techniques that would advance these goals, like privacy preserving techniques like differentially private, stochastic gradient descent, for instance, is one example. Although it may not answer the ethical questions, it has some technical flavor to kind of contribute to the broader question of privacy and data protection, federated learning, and things like that. So these are ethical principles of AI. And as I said, this slide is not an exhaustive list of ethical principles, for the very reason that ethical principles are work in progress. Now, after we discussed this like basics of ethics and AI, what it is, why we need it, and the ethical principles of AI, now we can talk a little more about the different areas where ethical questions would be arising in the application of AI. And one of those is AI and the future of jobs. So if you read any news about AI these days, chances are you came across about something that says, oh, we're going to be replaced by robots sometime down the line. That's not an unfounded claim. And there is a possibility that some sectors could be needing less humans and more machines or AI agents in the future. But it raises a very important ethical question beyond like economics. So back in 2016 at the World Economic Forum, Julia Bosman kind of articulated what she calls the top 10 ethical issues in artificial intelligence. So what we're going to talk about in the coming slides is, largely inspired by what Julia said back then, which remains to be very relevant today. Okay, so AI and the future of jobs. So Julia uses this example of the trucking industry or trucking market, and the fact that it employs millions of individuals in the United States alone, and probably more in other places. So the question she poses is, what would happen to them, the truck drivers who are making a living out of trucking, if the self-driving trucks that were promised by Elon Musk, because this is based on what Elon Musk said at the time, become widely available in the next decade or so, right? This is a very frightening outlook for a specific sector of trucking. But this, you can extend this to many other sectors where automation could replace humans. But on the other hand, you can also look at the flip side of this scenario where, if we consider the lower risk of accidents, then self-driving trucks seem an ethical choice, right? So there's a lot of accidents that happen because of trucks, and truck drivers die and so on. Therefore, if we make this trucks autonomous, then we're going to save lives, right? So this seems ethical. This seems morally appealing, right? But the ethical question that we raise here is this dynamics between mass unemployment, because if we replace all trucks by self-driving trucks, all truck drivers by self-driving trucks, then there will be mass unemployment. So we have to kind of find jobs for these people. And then there's the other side of the story, which is low accident rate. So even if the self-driving truck crashes, maybe the person, since there's nobody in driving it, that will save the driver. Of course, if the self-driving truck crashes with another vehicle that is carrying passengers and drivers, then there is another consequence, right? So it's not purely the argument that low accident rate would be ethically it's ethically sound may not always be true. Okay, so you can see how fluid the argument is here. But in general, there is this ethical question of mass unemployment versus low accident rates. So where is the trade-off here? And so in the same article, Julia cites this evidence where looking at, jobs, like jobs that could be automated, about 78, close to 80% of physical work, for example, welding, soldering, assembly line, like in automotive companies, food preparation and packaging and so on, this could be replaced by AI models or robots strictly speaking. And there's some 25% of unpredictable physical work, like construction, forestry, and other things. This could be hard to automate. So as you can see, a third of most of this routine jobs could be automated, right? So the question remains, so if machines take over, how would we distribute wealth and be fair towards contributions in the so-called post-labor society? What we have right now is predominantly a labor society. After the industrial revolution, what we have is a labor society. But one of the disruptions that AI would bring is we might end up with a post-labor society where we're not supposed to do a lot of physical work or repetitive work because this could be taken over by robots. So this has implications on inequality, and inequality, which is already there. Remember what we said in the fairness lecture, where we opened the lecture by saying we live in a very unfair world, right? So there's always inequality. There has always been inequality, and this inequality is more pronounced for some groups than others, historically speaking. So the inequality will take a new shape and could lead to a violence or adverse effect on vulnerable populations. And the question then becomes who benefits from the wealth generated from, let's say, an army of robots that replaced humans to automate this most of manual labor. Is it the robot owners or the people or the companies that bought the robots? Well, that's a very important question. So generally, the ethical question is wealth distribution. It has a great deal of disparity already, and the replacement of humans by AI bots or robots would basically make the problem worse. So the wealth distribution inequality would be getting larger and morals, right? So that's something to look into. Another important thing that we have to consider when we look at ethics and AI is this notion of humans versus machines. So at least in the sense of computer science or identifying or differentiating between humans and machines, there is this well-established test called the Turing test, where you would ask a question or you would give a challenge to an agent to identify or to differentiate whether the agent is a person, a human, a real human or not. Because there are things that software bots or software agents can do, and the humans they can do, they can't do, but humans can do, right? For example, solving captchas and things like that. Of course, solving captchas is becoming more or less outdated, or at least in the traditional sense of solving captchas, those are also broken, as we know from the security literature. So in 2018, this is from Time magazine, a bot named Eugene Guzman as the Turing challenge for the first time. And what it did was it fooled the majority of the judges into thinking that they were dealing with a human being. So it's a bot, but it kind of behaved like a human. So it basically passed the Turing test. So the question then is, it's really tough to kind of use or rely on the Turing test as a differentiator between humans and software bots anymore. So the ethical question is, what does it mean to be human when bots seem to basically mimic what humans do, right? So we have to reconsider these established ways of putting apart humans from machines through, for example, mechanisms like the Turing test. In computer science, the Turing test is sort of established method to put apart humans from machines. So the boundary is becoming a little bit fuzzy. Another point is bias and how it relates to ethical pitfalls. So when AI models make mistakes, for example, in the fairness lecture, we talked about the COMPAS data set that is used by police departments for predicting how likely an offender would reoffend again. We have seen examples where these models could be racist. So, for instance, the recidivism likelihood estimation was one of the examples where ProPublica kind of found out that COMPAS is biased against blacks compared to white defendants. The ethical question we have over here is how much do we rely on biased decisions, because these biased decisions could also clash with the ethical norms that we have. So we're saying everybody should be treated equally, everybody is equal under the law and so on, but we are relying on AI models that are kind of violating this principle. Another important issue as it relates to ethics is what I call weaponization. The word weaponization from English by replacing EA with AI, just to indicate this is AI. So this is my own term. So weaponization. So the weaponization of AI for doing some harm or something malicious. So weaponization, the notion of weaponization is a very important one because it invokes ethical questions, right? So why would someone use a technology that was supposed to be helping humanity and weaponize it for doing harm, right? So the more powerful AI becomes, and it's becoming, the more it can be used for destructive purposes. And AI is not an exception in this case. So for example, the internet, when it started like 40 years ago or so, was, the main goal was communication and exchange of information, sharing, etc. But now there's all kinds of, bad stuff that happens over the internet. So any technology could be twisted for bad intentions and by achieving harmful purposes, right? So AI is not an exception in that sense. So here's some examples. So for example, there are armored drones that are used in the United States, by the United States, by the UK, by Israel, as we speak in the war in the Middle East. There are armored drones that are owned by, for example, geopolitical adversaries of the US or generally the West, like Iran and China. And when we add cybersecurity into the mix, so for example, this drones could be hacked, and it's really hard to imagine what the consequences of hacking into drones and military weapons that are backed by AI models or robots is gonna cause. So the ethical question here is, what if the AI agent is abused or misused, right? So you could design an AI agent that would participate in a war against an adversary, but it could be abused or misused by some hacking actions that would happen from your adversary, right? It could, for example, a drone could be redirected to hit a friend nation instead of an adversary nation. What would happen in that case, right? So there's a whole bunch of scenarios where the weaponization of AI could create a lot of danger. And so when we develop, deploy, and use this AI for military or offensive purposes, this requires making use of AI to enhance the capabilities of conventional weapons that we use to create an entirely new family of weapons which have autonomous power or semi-autonomous power in making decisions, very important decisions, right? There was a Forbes article that kind of articulated about the possibility of AI weaponization. And there is a reason why we are kind of skeptical and scared of this kind of scenario of AI weaponization, because there's enough evidence that the military wants AI to replace human decision-making in live battles or in live wars, right? And I believe we are seeing examples of this in the wars that we are witnessing as we speak. The other important aspect of AI weaponization is cyber warfare. The cyberspace has become a space where wars happen, right? Countries or nations fight and so on. So this AI-powered cyber weapons can be employed for offensive operations, including hacking, data manipulation, disruption of critical infrastructure. So we've seen examples even without AI. So AI is going to add into, it's basically adding like gasoline to an existing flame. So what AI weaponization could give to this kind of warfare actions is it can enhance the speed and sophistication of cyber attacks, making them more difficult, sometimes impossible to detect and defend against, because they would evolve with a faster pace, and detection and countermeasure techniques may not cope up with this. There is another idea around AI weaponization, which is autonomous weapons, right? So weapons could be fully autonomous, making decisions on their own, just like humans, without any intervention from humans. And these are armored drones and manned ground vehicles and autonomous cyber weapons and so on. So this is also a very frightening dimension for which we don't have any regulations at the moment. But hopefully down the line, we might need regulations, because otherwise it would be out of control. And weaponization has also this aspect of enhanced targeting and warfare, where the AI can be used to improve the precision, speed, and effectiveness of targeting military operations. For example, using AI models for intelligence gathering, identifying targets, and doing like very precise attacks or strikes using autonomous AI agents. And more broadly, information warfare is another important factor that is going to affect, the way AI is going to be used in the future. So in that sense, So the information warfare, AI could be weaponized for spreading disinformation, propaganda, and conducting psychological operations. This is already happening. It will just get worse. And these algorithms can basically analyze vast amounts of data. They would help to kind of identify blind spots of the enemy and manipulate public opinion, for example, in targeted messaging for political campaigns and other important events in the society. In the worst case scenario, AI could be weaponized for building biological weapons, because we already know that AI is used for advancing drug discovery and similar applications. But just like any other technology which could be twisted for malicious purposes, it could be twisted for exploring, for example, the different combinations of molecules towards biological weapons. So if you can explore different combination of molecules to discover drugs, why not use it for, if it goes to the wrong hands, this could happen. So in general, the weaponization of AI raises significant ethical, legal, and strategic concerns, including the potential for unintended consequences, conflicts happening here and there, people losing, control over military operations, or just outright breaking international humanitarian laws. So the ultimate impact of this is going to be, there are ongoing debates and efforts at the national and international levels to kind of regulate and control the use of AI in military contexts. But this negotiations and debates are at the early stages. The AI and robotics communities, because in the sense of AI weaponization, I think this is a community that's directly involved, face a very important ethical question or decision, which is basically whether to support or oppose the development of this lethal autonomous weapon systems, or the so-called laws. And at this point, these technologies have reached this stage of deployment, and this is already feasible, and it's going to be more feasible and more prevalent as we look forward. So the stakes are definitely high, and some analysts actually term or describe this lethal autonomous weapon systems as the third revolution in warfare after gunpowder and nuclear arms. So gunpowder, well, we started wars with, sticks and axes or whatever, and then we advanced it thanks to the Industrial Revolution to gunpowder, right? Semi-automatic weapons and things like that. And now we do have, in that process, we developed nuclear bomb, and now we might end up with, this lethal autonomous weapons because of AI. Okay, so that was on AI weaponization. So I intentionally spent a lot of time on that because that's one of the most critical things we look at when we talk about ethics and AI. And now we have AI and the environment, or broadly speaking, the planet we live in. As you may know, the size of large language models is growing at a very, very astronomical rate. So in 2018, we started with 10 million parameters of models. And in 2022, we ended up with 10 trillion. So this is a very, by any measure, this is a very large astronomical development of size, or increase in size of models. So what does size has to do with environment? Of course, the inflation in size has implications on energy consumption. For example, this model called Bloom, the Big Science Large Open Source Open Access Multilingual Language Model, which has about 176 billion parameters, about close to 60 languages, and it's open source and open access. For training that model for one cycle of training, the energy consumption could power about 30 houses for a year, households for a year in the United States. So this is an estimation made by the creators of this large language model. Okay, so there's a great deal of energy consumption. the other aspect of this is wherever there is energy consumption, there is carbon emission, right? Depending on the kind of energy you're using, but most of the energy that we use emits carbon. So as you know, climate change is a big issue, and it's deemed as an existential threat by the United Nations already. And there is the Paris Accord, where countries or nations have agreed to reduce their carbon footprint because the planet's getting warmer and warmer. So on top of the challenge we have with carbon footprint because of our industrialization efforts here and there, now we have brought large language models into the equation. So the problem got a little complicated, right? So current large language models emit an alarming rate of carbon dioxide. For example, taking the same Bloom model that we just described earlier, to train that model in one cycle, it would emit about 25 tons of carbon dioxide. Sasha Lucioni, who is from Hugging Face, gave a very interesting TED talk recently. And in that talk, she kind of describes the environmental impact of large language models. And she does this comparative infographic where she starts with Bloom, which emits about 25 tons, and compares it against other larger models like OPT, Gopher, and GPT-3, which emits like 500, more than 500 tons of carbon dioxide. We're right now, as we speak, at GPT-5. GPT-5 is on the horizon, right? So you can imagine how much the carbon emission is going to be. So we're already struggling to kind of keep cut down on the carbon emission in the sense of the global warming that is happening because of other things that we're doing. Now this is like, making the problem even worse. So this is a very important priority. So we talk about hypothetical risks that AI could wipe us out, or AI could, do all kinds of harms. But we could wipe ourselves out if we keep adding this much carbon dioxide, because the planet gets warmer and warmer, and we end up with a lot of natural disasters because of the fact that the planet is warming and the ice is melting and so on. Okay, so that's on the impact of AI and environment and the ethical questions thereof. Another important ethical consideration for AI is AI and copyrighted material. So AI and copyrighted material, there is a great deal of copyrighted material that we put on the internet. So for example, artists or authors put their career on the line when they share their artwork or their books, etc. And musicians and so on. So there is more than enough evidence that models, specifically diffusion models, use copyrighted materials without permission. For example, using artists, so mimicking styles of artists and generating images based on a style of a specific artist, right? This idea of, mimicking or copying copyrighted material from artists, it also happens to books, and we have seen examples of authors who witnessed, their copyrighted materials ingested by large language models like GPT. So the ethical question here is how to protect intellectual property in the face of AI basically ingesting this copyrighted material without permission from the copyright owners or the original inventors of this intellectual property. So the story is not absolutely bleak when you look at AI versus copyrighted material. Here I just highlight one example of a project that I am aware of. So it's called the GLAZE project from the University of Chicago. What it is doing is in the previous lectures, specifically on adversarial examples, we talked about perturbations, like when we perturb an input and try to fool a model, right? So perturbation could be used to kind of discourage diffusion models from directly copying an artist's piece of artwork so that, the model would be confused, right? So basically what we're doing here is without protection, if this is a piece of art, you're going to train as a diffusion model trainer, you would train to mimic the style of the artist and fine tune this model and basically generate images that are going to mimic the artist's style. Therefore, you can basically infringe the copyright. So what the Glaze project does is the original art is given, and it would basically add small modifications, technically speaking, perturbations, as in adversarial perturbation, to basically create a barely visible, perturbation that doesn't change the quality of the art, but this art is glazed a little bit. And this would poison the diffusion model's training, and then the diffusion model would fail to mimic the artist's style. So in the midst of all these pitfalls and ethical questions that we are raising, there are also efforts that are trying to help out in discouraging this outright copying of copyrighted material and using them for profit. So perturbation, although this is an adversarial tactic, could be used for good, right? So that's basically what is going on here. Okay, so that's on copyright. The other is this question of rationality, whether AI agents can act rational or not. So AI agents, so in general, when we talk about computing technology, the computing technology is normative. That is to mean there is always some intended purpose for a given technology, right? So which means you can define rationality based on that. For instance, there's this thing called camel jockeys or camel racers, where a person needs to be super lightweight to have an advantage in the camel race. And one way this is done in real life is very young and poor boys are kind of starved to be so lightweight so that you can use them as camel jockeys, right? So when people came up with this idea of, instead of enslaving these people, because this is just, outright human right violation, and starving people is not a good thing, it's not ethically, morally correct, right? So people came up with robotic camel jockeys, and this robotic camel jockeys were replacing the boys. So now the ethical question is basically AI having ethical impact for the boys, right? So the boys are now relieved of this sort of slavery of being hungry for a long time just to stay lightweight for the sake of winning the competition, right? So you could say this is ethical, but the broader question is we want rationalism to be explicit, right? So the implicit ethical impact, for instance, of autopilot of airplanes, or using automated techniques in a web banking software and other kinds of software is an implicit ethical impact. But the explicit ethical impact is as we speak, it's very elusive at the moment. So not purposefully we don't have any robot or any AI agent that is purposefully or explicitly rational. Even if what we see here, where the robotic camel jockeys are replacing boys, the implication seems rational, but the AI is not conscious enough to take this explicit rational decisions. So speaking of explicitly ethical AI, there was this article by Van den Hoven and Lockhorst, where they talk about this deontic logic for statements of permission and obligations, where they ask this question of whether duty and obligation mean anything to the AI agent, because that's part of the ethical philosophy that we discussed at the beginning. So the epistemologic logic for statements of belief and knowledge, right? So the belief is something that you establish out of your will, and knowledge is something that you obtain or procure. So in the sense of this action logic for statements of action, for most AI agents, this is implicit, so there is some action logic as to what they're doing, but they're not explicitly ethical. Okay, so the moral of the story here is they're not explicitly ethical. Okay, we're coming to the end of the part for ethics. So the two last pieces that we're going to talk about is large language models and ethics, and then accountability. So we've said a lot about large language models, but for sake of completeness, I'll briefly talk about them. So there was this survey that looked at these risks posed by large language models, and some of those risks have ethical implications. So there are about 6 risks that are identified by this survey, and I encourage you to read it if you're interested in large language models and the risks. And this is done by a consortium of people from different companies and organizations working on AI at the intersection of AI and ethics and other topics. These are the 6 risks: discrimination, exclusion, and toxicity, information hazards, misinformation, malicious uses, weaponization, human-computer interaction harms, and automation, access, and environmental impacts. So as you can see, for example, exclusion and toxicity it has ethical implications, right? So if the society claims to be inclusive, then if the society ends up building a model that is exclusionary, then it doesn't really serve the purpose. The other thing is misinformation, right? So telling the truth is considered to be the the ethical compass of many societies. Then misinformation is kind of the opposite. Environmental impacts of AI, we've talked about this. So harms could rise from environmental or downstream economic impacts of the language model. So like if the language model is taking people's jobs, and if it is emitting a lot of carbon dioxide, then we're back to square one. On the survey, you see a lot of interesting analysis about the risk area, the mechanism, the type of harm, and the technical mitigation approaches and the evidence of this harm. And you would see a whole bunch of interesting things that would tie back to the ethical principles that we're talking about. For example, if you have misinformation harms, the type of harm could be unethical actions by users, right? So users would do something that doesn't go with their ethical values and principles. And on the environmental and socioeconomic harms, you would see that the harms that you would observe are, for example, environmental harm, emitting a lot of carbon dioxide, for instance, right? And there are also countermeasures suggested by this survey. For example, increased training efficiency. One way to kind of take care of the carbon emission is to increase the efficiency, just like we are increasing efficiency of cars and factories and so on. We can increase the efficiency of the models, so reducing carbon footprint and reducing energy consumption. Okay, so the last piece of the ethics component of the lecture is accountability. And ironically enough, some 40 years ago, Joseph Weizenbaum, an MIT professor, a computer science professor, a well-known professor, actually gave a talk at IBM in 1979. And this is actually a screenshot of his slide. And as you can see, in 1979, we didn't have a PowerPoint, therefore, his slide was not fancy, but the content of the slide was pretty telling, which is exactly what we're thinking about today. So it says a computer can never be held accountable. Okay. Therefore, a computer must never make a management decision. So some 40-something years later, we're using machines to make management decisions. For example, machines could decide whether somebody would get an interview on a job application or not, right? So as you can see, there were smart people who thought about this some 40 years ago. And speaking of accountability for AI decisions, here is a scenario. So suppose some large language models like ChatGPT advises a user to take a drug. So maybe the user prompted the large language model saying, I'm feeling, I'm having the symptoms, what do you suggest, right? So the user follows the advice and takes the drug. Okay. The user dies of complication from the drug. Now, the ethical question is, who is to blame, right? Who takes the responsibility? You would say, oh, the designer or whoever is behind this model, but things are not that kind of well thought or very clear as to where we stand today, right? So it's really hard to kind of pin down this and say, this person or this entity is to blame. Okay, this is a very important ethical dilemma that we have today. And as a matter of fact, somebody kind of died following some medical directions from ChatGPT. So when we talk about accountability and ethical AI, when the AI fails, who is to blame? The programmer, the end user, and so on. So we have these endless questions. So one theory that we have is all criteria that we apply to humans performing social functions must be applied to AI. Because if AI is effectively replacing humans, why not hold AI accountable to the same standards as humans? In theory, this sounds appealing, but in practice, it's really hard to kind of deal with this because humans are rational. Humans can explain themselves. Yes, AI models could explain themselves, but not in a way that humans could explain themselves. So there are things like responsibility, transparency, auditability, incorruptibility, and so on that we anticipate from humans when we talk about accountability, which we don't have as we speak from AI agents. And it's really hard to kind of encode this into AI agents because these are inherently, for the most part, human. But there is this theory which says, we have to hold them accountable the way we hold people accountable. And the last piece is predictability. Okay, so in summary, on the ethics component of the lecture, we talked about what ethics is and what AI ethics is in particular, why do we need it, and the ethical principles and different examples of ethical pitfalls or situations where ethical questions are very important. And in particular, we talked about, for example, AI and the future of jobs, this boundary between humans and machines becoming very fuzzy, bias being a precursor for ethical pitfalls, the multifaceted, weaponization of AI and its implications, energy and carbon footprint of AI, copyright material and AI, the need for explicit rationality, large language models and the multimodal ethical pitfalls, and the need for human-like accountability for AI. Okay, now we'll shift to the last piece of the lecture, which is about regulation. Okay, so they said I'll be brief on this one, and the reason being there isn't much. Most of it, the stuff is work in progress. Okay, so what we're going to do, as I said at the beginning, is I'll briefly highlight US-centric efforts, and then I'll give you an example sector-specific contribution from our lab, and I'll briefly talk about the European Union and the United Nations. So in the United States, like many other countries, the US has taken AI governance and AI regulation and generally, responsible and trustworthy AI very seriously. So what is going on? One notable effort that came out of, the executive order from the White House, the National AI Initiative Act of the 2020 from President Biden, is the National Institute for Standards in Technology, or NIST, came up with what we call the AI risk management framework that you see over here. And that is sort of a concrete effort that is happening in terms of risk management for AI. It's not a regulation, it's just a risk management framework, but it's a sector agnostic, customizable AI risk management framework. And the way this is the AI risk is framed is, safety is one important component, security and resilience is another component, explainability and interpretability is another one, privacy preserving or privacy enhancement, fair with harmful biases managed. Pretty much everything we have covered in this course is kind of incorporated into this. Accountability and transparency and validity and reliability are also parts of the framework. And the challenges that are outlined in the AI risk management framework from NIST are, for example, how do we deal with risk management? How do we encode and incorporate risk tolerance? How do we do risk prioritization? How do we do risk integration and management? And the way this is kind of articulated is through what is called AI lifecycle and AI actors. So we have people and the planet, and we have the application context, task and output, the AI model, data and input. And then we have this phases, which are basically continual monitoring, which are, done through continuous monitoring. So you plan and you collect and process data, plan and design, operate and monitor, deploy and use, and verify and validate, build and use the model. This just cycle continues until you get to a point where the technology is mature enough. And at the core of the NIST AI risk management framework is this articulation of governance, mapping, measuring, and managing, where govern has to do with the risk management in the organization, culture, and the map is, this has to do with, basically making sure that what you're mapping out as a risk goes with the context that you're identifying. And then there is manage, where risks are prioritized and acted upon based on projected impact. And there is measurement, where you would be doing, some tracking. So the AI risk management framework also comes with a playbook for people and organizations to adopt. So I encourage you to check this if you're interested in risk management in AI. And another important piece of the AI risk management framework is what we call AI risk management profiles. So these are implementations of the AI risk management framework functions, categories, and subcategories for a specific setting. So this is basically the instantiation of the risk management framework for a specific domain or a problem. And they call them use case profiles, for example, for hiring or fair housing, or other profiles like, for example, current state versus the target state that you anticipate after incorporating AI, or cross-sectoral profiles, for example, large language models, cloud-based services, and so on. So in our lab, we developed a use case or a profile for autonomous vehicles, and specifically for traffic sign detection. So the motivation for this was the public does not really trust autonomous vehicles that are using AI today. And there is a need for organizations to deploy AI risk management processes that account for people, processes, and technologies. And my former student, Christine, did this, basically dedicated her thesis work for developing this AI risk management framework use case for autonomous vehicles, and specifically for the traffic sign recognition. So she developed this for traffic sign recognition. She also conducted, public survey and gathers industry expert feedback as to whether this is a useful risk management profile. So traffic sign recognition at a high level has this components. So phase 0 is image acquisition through camera and other sensors like LiDAR and so on. And the phase 1 is color segmentation, specifically into these RGB color channels. And then region of interest identification, so like shape detection, color filtering, bounding, like box scaling, and so on. And then you would do feature extraction and do classification of traffic signs, right? And the actual full report of the use case profile is on this link. So if you're interested, you can check this out from this URL. So this is a GitHub repository of what we did. and you would find it from the GitHub repository of our lab, and the links are down there. So the traffic sign recognition profile that we did actually identifies about 26 AI actors. So we did an exhaustive analysis of what are the possible actors that we need to take into account when we do this. Here is an example of the list of risks that we identified, the likelihood, the impact, and risk scores. So this is a full-fledged, risk management framework. Here's a concrete example of one risk where the risk is stop signs on school buses are not correctly identified by the autonomous vehicle, because sometimes school buses in the United States would do this, would have this physical stop sign on the left side to kind of signal the vehicle behind them. So the autonomous vehicle might be only looking at traffic signs on the road, and it may overlook this kind of thing. So misclassification could happen, and the car could crash into the bus, right? So examples of this nature are very important because there are safety implications, and we do like risk metrics for likelihood versus impact calculation to kind of quantify whether this is a risk worth mitigating or not. So we have the category of the risk, the description, the adversary. In this case, there is no adversary. It's just like a pitfall or sort of a corner case. And the likelihood is this is possible. The impact is major because the car could crash to the bus and people could be harmed, students could be harmed, and the actors impacted could be a whole bunch of stakeholders, and the strategy would be to mitigate it, right? So we propose this kind of risk management, concrete risk management steps for traffic sign recognition. Okay, so we looked at, we identified rather 8 malicious actors that we have in the report as well. And something that is nice about this framework that we proposed is we submitted it to NIST, and now our framework, our risk management profile for traffic sign recognition for autonomous vehicles is now part of the NIST's Trustworthy and Responsible AI Resource Center. So we're very happy that this is, useful and impactful nationally or internationally, because NIST is the nationally mandated body by the United States government to set standards in technology and specifically in AI. So we are happy that our contribution is included in this resource center. And here is the URL for our profile that's included in the NIST Trustworthy and Responsible AI Resource Center. So the NIST Trustworthy and Responsible AI Resource Center has other things as well. In addition to the risk profiles, where our profile is included, there is a playbook, the glossary, standards tracker, and metrics, and many more. And this is something that is continuously improved and changing, so it's worth checking out repeatedly. So that's within the United States and what we contributed to the standards in the United States as well. So stepping out of the US, in other regions like the European Union and countries like the UK, France, and so on, they are also looking at, coming up with regulations for AI without necessarily hurting, innovation in AI. So there is the Artificial Intelligence Act by the European Union that was approved recently, and countries are also coming up with, for example, in the UK, there is this pro-innovation approach to AI regulation that was proposed, but other countries are taking similar measures. In the EU AI ethics guideline, you would see all these different components, which kind of tie back to the stuff that we covered in the course, like AI accountability, human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity and non-discrimination and fairness, societal and environmental well-being. So all this, in one way or another, are the topics that we covered in this course, and I'm, particularly happy that the coverage of the course is kind of, it goes well in line with what other people or other regional organizations like the European Union are looking at as well. At the United Nations level, there is an ongoing work. There is an advisory body that is composed of many AI ethics and other areas of AI, where experts are advising and developing this AI regulation framework. They call it Governing AI for Humanity, and they recently put out an interim report. So basically, just like climate change, nuclear bomb, and so on, these are governed by a global body like the UN. The risks of AI are also being taken seriously with equal weight. So this is work in progress by the UN AI Advisory Council. And the ultimate goal is to kind of come up with a UN level regulatory framework that goes well with, the European Union's AI Act and what specific countries are doing as well. So in summary, in general, so we've looked at ethics of AI and where we discussed a whole bunch of topics in the governance of AI as to what is going on. But, in the future, 3-4 years down the line, the same lecture on ethics and governance could be slightly different because both ethics and AI, both the literature, the discourse on ethics and AI, ethics and regulation is changing. But hopefully this lecture gave you a broad overview of what we should be looking at or considering as far as ethics of AI and governance of AI is concerned. So with that, we'll end the lecture and ultimately also end the course. So thank you for attending this course, and hopefully you got some useful information out of the course through the previous lectures and also this last one. I would look forward to your feedbacks on the YouTube videos that I am releasing so as to kind of improve the future versions of this course. Thank you very much for sticking around.